The dog would later save 3 lives before the sun came up, but on the morning the sheriff's cruiser rolled up the gravel drive, all anyone in Caldwell County knew was that a scarred, half-blind animal was living behind a broken-down trailer, and that the man who owned it looked like he hadn't slept in a year. Neither fact was wrong. Neither fact was the whole truth either. The trailer sat at the dead end of Route 9, past the last mailbox that still had a flag on it, where the asphalt gave up and turned to red clay and gravel. Daniel Reyes had been living there for 14 months, in a single-wide that had belonged to his uncle before cancer took him, and before that had belonged to nobody in particular, just sat there rusting through Georgia summers and Georgia winters, waiting for somebody desperate enough to want it. Reyes had been desperate enough. He'd signed the deed transfer in a VA parking lot with a pen that skipped, using the hood of his truck as a table, 6 weeks after his discharge papers cleared. He'd been a Marine for 11 years, explosive ordnance disposal, most of that time, which meant he'd spent more hours than he could count crouched over things designed by other human beings to kill him in ways both fast and slow. He still dreamed sometimes about the particular click a pressure plate made, a sound so small most people would never notice it, but a sound that lived permanently in the base of his skull now, the way a smell can live in a house long after the thing that made it is gone. The blast that ended his career happened outside a village whose name he still didn't say out loud, not because it was classified, but because saying it felt like inviting it back into the room. Command called it a catastrophic equipment failure. Reyes called it something else, though for a long time he didn't have proof, only a feeling that sat in his gut like a swallowed stone, heavy and cold and impossible to cough up. He'd lost his right leg below the knee. He'd lost 60% of the hearing in his left ear. He'd lost his team leader, Staff Sergeant Marcus Ellery, a man who had 2 daughters back in Lubbock and a laugh that used to carry across a whole forward operating base. And in the chaos after the explosion, in the dust and the screaming and the medevac bird coming in low and fast, he had also lost track of a dog. A Belgian Malinois named Chief, who had been working the perimeter that morning, who had gone still and hard-eyed 30 seconds before the ground opened up, who had, by every account Reyes could later piece together, likely saved more lives that day than anyone would ever be able to prove. Nobody talked about the dog afterward. There was no ceremony for the dog. There was a line in an after-action report, 4 words long, that said K9 status unknown, and then there was nothing else, because paperwork about a piece of government property that couldn't be located didn't rate much attention when there were human casualties to process. Reyes came home with a titanium leg, a diagnosis of complex PTSD that the VA fought him on for 11 months before finally granting a rating he considered insulting, and a habit of sitting with his back to the wall in any room he entered. He worked construction for a while, until the vibration of a jackhammer started putting him back in that dust cloud outside the village whose name he didn't say. He tried a warehouse job after that, forklift certification and everything, until a coworker dropped a stack of pallets from too high, and the crash sent Reyes flat to the concrete floor with his hands over his head before his conscious mind even registered what had happened. By the time he moved into the trailer at the end of Route 9, he wasn't looking for work anymore. He was looking for quiet. He ate mostly out of cans, heated over a camp stove, because the trailer's electric range had died sometime during the previous decade, and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it. He kept the blinds drawn during the day and only opened them after dark, a habit that made his few neighbors, scattered thin along that stretch of road, decide early on that something wasn't right about the man in the rusted trailer. They weren't cruel about it mostly. Small towns rarely are, not at first. They just left him alone, the way you leave alone a dog you're not sure won't bite, which was, in a way that none of them yet understood, exactly the wrong metaphor and exactly the right one at the same time. It was late September, hot enough still that the cicadas hadn't quit for the year, when Reyes first saw the animal going through the trash cans behind his trailer. He'd stepped outside near midnight, unable to sleep, carrying a mug of instant coffee he wasn't going to finish. And there in the thin wash of his porch light was a shape moving low and careful between the cans, ribs showing through a coat gone patchy and dull, one ear torn nearly in half, a long puckered scar running from shoulder to hip on the left side, like something had once tried to open the dog up and been only partly successful. Ray's didn't move for a long moment. Old training held him still, the same stillness that used to let him watch a suspicious patch of disturbed dirt for 20 minutes without twitching. The dog froze too, head lifted, one eye catching the porch light with a strange pale shine that Ray's would later learn came from a cataract, the eye clouded nearly white, functionally blind. "Go on," Ray's said, low, more out of habit than any real hope the animal would understand him. "Ain't nothing here for you." The dog didn't run. That was the first thing that struck him as strange. A stray with any sense would have bolted at the sound of a human voice, especially a rough one at midnight. This one just watched him, weight shifted slightly back, ready to move but not moving, sizing him up the way Ray's had once been trained to size up a room before he walked into it. "I mean it," Ray's said, though he made no move toward the trash cans, no move toward the dog at all. "I don't got dog food. I barely got people food." The dog dropped its head, snagged something out of a torn bag, the wrapper from a can of Vienna sausages Ray's had eaten 2 nights before, and trotted off into the tree line at the edge of his property, unhurried, like it had already decided he wasn't worth the energy of fear. Ray's stood on the porch a long time after it was gone, coffee going cold in his hand, feeling something he hadn't expected to feel. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself a lot of things were nothing, most nights. The dog came back 3 nights later, and then 2 nights after that. Ray's started noticing a pattern, the animal always arriving sometime between 11 and 1, always moving along the same low route through the brush, always giving his trailer a wide, careful berth before it got close, the way something trained does when it's checking a perimeter rather than something wild does when it's simply hungry. He started leaving a little more out, not on purpose, he told himself, just happened to have some extra to spare. Half a can of chili one night, a heel of bread the next. He didn't call to the dog anymore, didn't try to coax it closer, just let it come and go on its own schedule, the way you'd leave a door unlocked for someone without ever quite inviting them inside. "You're gonna get used to this," he told the dark yard one night, voice flat, talking mostly to hear a human voice in his own head. "And then you're gonna get disappointed when I don't have nothing left to give. That's how it goes. That's how it always goes." He didn't know, saying it, how much of that was about the dog and how much was about everything else. It was the second week of October when the trouble started, and it started, as these things often do, with something small and almost funny in hindsight, though nobody was laughing at the time. A woman named Carol Whitfield, who lived a quarter-mile down Route 9 in a tidy brick ranch with a mailbox shaped like a rooster, had been out walking her toy poodle after dinner when the scarred dog came out of the trees along the property line, low and silent, and simply stood there in the road, staring. It didn't growl, it didn't bark, it didn't so much as take a step toward her. But Carol Whitfield had never in her life seen an animal that looked quite like that, one half its face scarred pale, one eye clouded white, a body built lean and hard under matted fur, standing dead still in the middle of the road at dusk like something out of a story meant to scare children. She turned around and walked home fast, poodle scooped up under one arm, and called the sheriff's office the moment she got through her front door. By the next morning, 3 more calls had come in, each one adding a little more color than the last, the way stories do when they pass hand to hand through a small community. A rabid animal, a dangerous stray. Somebody said they'd heard it had already bitten a child, though no child could later be produced who had actually been bitten. Somebody else said it belonged to the man in the trailer at the end of the road, the strange one who kept his blinds shut all day, and that was enough for the story to take its final shape. A dangerous man with a dangerous dog, and somebody ought to do something about it before somebody got hurt. Deputy Sheriff Wade Kessler was the one who drew the call. He was 26 years old, 3 years into the job, decent enough at his work, but not yet seasoned enough to know the difference between a genuine threat and a scared, hungry stray that had wandered too close to the wrong porch light. He pulled his cruiser up Ray's gravel drive a little after 10 in the morning, gravel popping under the tires, and Ray's heard it from inside the trailer and felt his whole body go tight and still in a way that had nothing to do with the dog at all. Well, he hadn't had a good relationship with uniforms and flashing lights since he'd come home. It wasn't rational, he knew that. But Rational didn't have much say in the matter when his hands started sweating and his pulse climbed into his ears the second he heard that particular crunch of tires on gravel, the particular double thunk of a car door swinging shut with government-issue weight behind it. He made himself walk to the door, made himself open it slow, hands visible, the way he'd learned a long time ago in a country far from Georgia that sudden movements got misread and misread movements got people killed. "Morning," Kessler said, one hand resting near his belt without quite touching anything on it, the posture of a young officer trying to look calm and not quite managing it. "Got some calls about a stray dog out this way. Aggressive, folks are saying. Somebody said it might be yours." "It's not mine," Reyes said, which was true in the strictest sense, though something in his chest argued with the word the moment it left his mouth. "But it's been coming around your property." "It comes around plenty of properties, I'd guess." Reyes kept his voice even, kept his weight balanced, an old habit of making sure he could move fast if he needed to, though there was no reasonable version of this conversation that should require it. "It's not aggressive, it's scared. There's a difference if you know what to look for." Kessler's hand drifted a little closer to his belt, not quite consciously, the kind of small tell that told Reyes everything about how this young man had been trained to think about strays and the men who kept them out here at the end of gravel roads. "Mind if I take a look around back?" There wasn't really a way to say no to that without making things worse, so Reyes stepped off the porch and led him around, and there, in the shade at the tree line, lay the dog curled tight, one ear flicking at the sound of their footsteps, the clouded eye tracking them with an alertness that belied the animal's apparent stillness. Kessler's hand finally did settle on the grip of his sidearm, not drawing it, just resting there, and Reyes felt something old and sharp come up in him, something that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with watching a man's hand move toward a weapon while an innocent thing lay defenseless on the ground in front of him. "Don't," Reyes said, and his voice came out lower and harder than he meant it to, the voice he hadn't used since a rank he no longer held. "That dog hasn't done a thing to anybody. You draw on it, and I promise you, you're gonna have a real problem, and it won't be the dog causing it." The two men stood there a moment, the tension stretched thin and taut between them, and it was the dog of all creatures present who broke it. It rose, slow and stiff, and instead of bolting for the trees the way every survival instinct should have told it to, it walked, actually walked, deliberate and unhurried, until it was standing directly between Reyes and the deputy, body angled slightly head low, eyes on Kessler in a posture that wasn't aggression so much as it was position. Cover. The kind of stance a trained animal takes when it's placing itself between a threat and someone it has decided, for reasons of its own, is worth protecting. Kessler's hand came off his belt on its own, some older and more honest part of him recognizing what he was looking at even if his conscious mind hadn't caught up yet. "That's not normal stray behavior," he said, quieter now. "No," Reyes agreed, "it isn't." It took another 20 minutes of talking, Reyes keeping his own voice level with an effort that cost him more than he'd admit, before Kessler agreed to let the matter drop without a formal complaint or an animal control call, on the condition that Reyes get the dog looked at by a vet, get it some kind of collar or tag, something to show it belonged to somebody and wasn't a public menace running loose. Reyes said he'd think about it. Kessler said he'd be checking back. Neither man entirely believed the other, but the cruiser pulled back down the gravel drive without further incident, and that, for the moment, was that. Reyes stood in his yard a long time after the dust settled, looking down at the animal, who had returned to its spot in the shade like nothing at all had happened. "You didn't have to do that," he said. The dog didn't answer, of course. Dogs don't. But it thumped its tail once twice against the packed dirt, and Reyes felt something crack open in his chest that he'd kept sealed shut for a very long time. "All right," he said, mostly to himself. "All right, guess we're doing this." The nearest vet was a woman named Dr. Priya Anand, who ran a small clinic out of a converted farmhouse 11 miles toward town, the kind of practice that still made house calls for large animals and didn't ask too many questions about a man who paid in cash and flinched at the sound of the exam room door or closing behind him. Reyes borrowed a length of rope for a makeshift lead, and to his mild surprise, the dog let itself be led without much fuss, walking at his hip the whole 11 miles like it had done it 1,000 times before, which, as it turned out, it had. Dr. Annan ran her hands over the animal with a gentleness Reyes found himself watching closely, some protective instinct rising in him that he hadn't planned on and didn't entirely understand yet. She noted the cataract in the left eye, old scar tissue consistent with a significant traumatic injury, evidence of past malnutrition, a slight asymmetry in the hips suggesting an old fracture that had healed without proper setting. "This is a Belgian Malinois," she said, running a hand along the dog's flank. "Purebred or close to it. You don't find many of these just wandering loose. They're working dogs mostly. Police, military, protection work. This breed doesn't do well without a job." Reyes felt the stone in his gut shift, though he couldn't have said why yet, not in words. Then Dr. Anand parted the fur behind the dog's left shoulder blade and went still. "Well," she said, "that answers some questions." There, tattooed into the skin in faded but legible ink, was a string of characters. A number, and beside it a designation, K9. Reyes leaned in close, and something in his chest went very cold and very still, the same stillness that used to come over him standing above a device he hadn't yet identified. He didn't know the exact number, but he knew the format. He'd seen it 100 times on 100 different dogs over 11 years of deployments, stenciled on kennel doors, printed on transport manifests, called out over radios in the clipped shorthand of handlers announcing themselves at checkpoints. "This dog was military," he said, and his voice didn't sound quite like his own. "Or contracted," Dr. Anand said. "There's private outfits that do this kind of tattoo too, for working and detection dogs on government contracts. Either way, somebody trained this animal for serious work, and somebody, somewhere, is supposed to have records on him." Reyes looked down at the dog, who sat quiet and patient at his feet, clouded eye turned up toward him like it was waiting for him to catch up to something it had already understood a long time ago. "I know somebody," Reyes said slowly. "I know exactly who to call." That night back at the trailer, Reyes sat at the small fold-down table with his old flip phone, the one he kept for the 2 or 3 people he still spoke to from his old life, and scrolled until he found the number for Gunnery Sergeant Ray Ortiz, retired now himself, who had spent the last 6 years of his career running the kennel program at a training facility Reyes wasn't supposed to name in casual conversation, but which everyone who'd served in that world simply called the farm. Ortiz picked up on the 4th ring, gravel-voiced and half asleep. "This better be good, Reyes. It's damn near midnight. I need you to run a tattoo number for me." There was a pause on the line, the particular kind of pause that meant Ortiz had gone from sleepy to alert in the space of a single sentence. "You in some kind of trouble?" "No, found a dog, Malinois. Beat to hell, one eye clouded, scarring like you wouldn't believe. Tattoos faded, but I can read most of it. Ray's read off the string of numbers and letters slow and careful, and on the other end of the line, he heard Ortiz go quiet in a different way now, the sound of a man writing something down, or maybe just thinking hard. Give me a day, Ortiz said finally. Some of these records are locked up tighter than they used to be, contractor stuff especially, but I got a guy. You always got a guy. That's how I'm still useful to anybody, Ortiz said, and there was almost a smile in it, the first easy thing either of them had said all conversation. How you doing, Danny, really? Reyes looked across the dim trailer at the dog, who had settled itself in the doorway between the small kitchen and the even smaller living area, not quite inside, not quite outside, watching him with that pale, clouded eye and the good dark one both. I've had better weeks, Reyes said. I've had worse ones too. That's not an answer. It's the one you're getting tonight. Ortiz let it go, the way old friends sometimes know when to let a thing go, and told him he'd call back when he had something. Reyes set the flip phone down on the table and sat there a long while in the near dark, listening to the cicadas outside and the dog's steady breathing a few feet away. And for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, the silence in that trailer didn't feel quite so much like a held breath. The call back came 2 days later, and it changed everything. You sitting down? Ortiz asked, and Reyes, standing in his kitchen with a can of beans warming on the camp stove, said that he was, even though he wasn't. Dog's name is Kai. F. Ortiz said, MWD designation, contracted through a private outfit called Aegis Tactical Solutions, working under DoD contract for supplemental K-9 support in theater. Explosive detection mostly, some patrol work, deployed twice. Second deployment ended early. Ortiz paused, and in that pause Reyes felt the floor of his understanding start to tilt. Records say the dog's handler was killed in action. Same incident far as I can piece together. That's in your own file, Danny. Same province, same date. Records say the dog was lost in transit during medical evacuation and presumed non-recoverable. Written off, no further tracking. Ray stood very still, the beans forgotten, the trailer around him seeming to recede into a kind of ringing silence. Chief's handler, he said, and he already knew the answer before he asked it. Some part of him had known it the moment Dr. Anand parted the fur and revealed that tattoo. Was that Ellery? Marcus Ellery, Ortiz confirmed, quiet now, the gravel gone soft in his voice. Staff sergeant, your team leader, same blast that took your leg. Reyes had to sit down. He lowered himself into the trailer's one good chair, and the dog, Chief, he was Chief. He had a name, and now Reyes had to think of him that way whether he was ready to or not, rose from where he'd been lying and crossed the small room and put his head down heavy and warm against Reyes's knee, as if he understood, in whatever way a dog understands anything, that something enormous had just shifted in the air between them. He was alive this whole time, Reyes said, mostly to himself. He's been out there this whole time, and nobody looked for him. Records say he was presumed dead in the chaos of the evac, Ortiz said. But Danny, I dug a little further than I probably should have. There's a gap in the paperwork, a gap that doesn't sit right with me. Aegis Tactical filed the loss report themselves, not the DoD liaison who was supposed to sign off on any K-9 disposition. And the equipment failure that caused your blast, the report attributes it to unmarked ordnance, standard stuff, nobody's fault, bad luck of war. But I know a guy who worked adjacent to that program, and he told me, off the record, there'd been complaints filed about faulty detection gear Aegis was supplying. Complaints that went nowhere. Complaints that got buried right around the time your unit got hit. Reyes sat with his hand resting on Chief's scarred head, feeling the old wound behind the dog's ear where fur had never quite grown back right, and felt the cold stone in his gut turn slowly, into something with a much sharper edge. "You're telling me," he said, "that the same company that might have sold my unit bad equipment is also the same company that lost track of the dog whose handler died because of it." "I'm telling you," Ortiz said, "that if I were you, I'd be very careful poking at this. Companies like Aegis don't get careless by accident. They get careless on purpose when it's cheaper than getting caught." Reyes looked down at Chief, who looked back up at him with that clouded eye and that good dark one, patient, steady, like he'd been waiting a long time for somebody to finally ask the right questions. "Careful," Reyes said slowly, "was never really my specialty, Ray. You remember that about me." "I remember," Ortiz said, and there was something like worry in his voice now, old friends' worry, the kind that comes from having watched a man walk toward danger before and not liking how it turned out. "Just watch yourself, and watch that dog. Whatever happened to him after that blast, it wasn't good. However he ended up loose and half-starved on your property, somebody let that happen or made it happen. You go pulling at that thread, you might not like what unravels." They talked a while longer, old habits and old jokes filling the space where the harder things had just been said, and when Reyes finally hung up the flip phone, he sat in the quiet trailer with his hand still resting on the dog's head, and for a long time neither of them moved. "Chief," he said finally, trying the name out loud, testing the shape of it in his mouth. The dog's ears came up, the torn one and the whole one both, and his tail thumped once against the floor, slow and certain, an answer as clear as any word could have been. "All right," Reyes said again, the way he had that first night in the yard, but it meant something different now. "All right, Chief, guess we're really doing this." What followed was a stretch of weeks that Reyes would later think of, when he let himself think back on that whole strange autumn at all, as the closest thing to peace he'd had since before the blast. It wasn't loud peace. It wasn't the kind you'd put in a movie. It was small and quiet and built one unremarkable day at a time, the way most real healing tends to be built, brick by brick, with no single dramatic moment you could point to and say, there, that was the turning point. "I'll end to you." The mornings became the anchor of it. Reyes had never been a morning person in his civilian life, not really, not since coming home, when mornings had become the hardest hours, the ones where the day stretched out ahead of him with nothing in it worth getting up for. But Chief didn't understand the concept of sleeping in, and within a week of settling into the trailer full-time, the dog had established a routine that Reyes found himself, almost against his will, falling into step with. Chief would wake with the first gray light, no earlier, no later, some internal clock calibrated by years of disciplined training that a season of neglect and wandering hadn't managed to erase. He'd rise from the folded blanket Reyes had set up for him in the corner of the main room. The dog had refused the actual bed Reyes offered at first, some old training keeping him low and close to an exit, and it took nearly 3 weeks before Chief allowed himself to sleep somewhere softer, somewhere further from the door, and he'd pad over and press his cold nose against whatever part of Reyes happened to be exposed, an ear, a hand, the back of his neck. Until Reyes groaned and swore and got up anyway. "You're worse than a drill instructor," Reyes told him one particular gray morning in late October, pulling on his prosthetic with the particular grunt of effort it always took, the stump still tender some mornings in ways that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with old nerve damage that never fully settled. "At least a drill instructor lets you sleep past 5. Chief sat by the door, patient, tail sweeping the floor in a slow metronome rhythm, watching Reyes fumble with the straps and buckles with an attentiveness that Reyes noticed but didn't yet understand. It would be another week before he realized the dog was, in his own way, standing guard during that vulnerable ritual, watching the door and the windows while his person's hands were occupied and his balance was compromised, an old habit from a job that had once required exactly that kind of vigilance. They walked the property line together every morning, a loose circuit that took them along the tree break at the edge of Reyes's few acres and back around by the old collapsed barn that had come with the land, and Ray's found that the walking did something for him that nothing else had managed since he'd come home. It wasn't the exercise, though the exercise helped. It was the rhythm of it. The dog's steady pace beside him, never pulling ahead, never lagging behind, matching him step for step the way a working partner does, and Ray's realized somewhere around the second week that his shoulders had stopped living up around his ears quite so much, that his eyes had stopped scanning every tree line for threats that weren't there quite so constantly. He started talking to the dog, at first only in the gruff, minimal way a man talks to himself when he's alone and doesn't want to admit he's lonely, and then slowly in longer and longer stretches, the way a man talks when he's finally found somebody who won't interrupt him, won't judge him, won't flinch at the things he has to say. "You ever get tired of it?" he asked one morning, the two of them sitting on the porch steps while the sun came up orange and low through the pines, being the only one who made it out, not made it out whole, made it out at all. Chief didn't answer, of course, but he lined his weight against Ray's leg, solid and warm, and Ray's found that the leaning was answer enough most days. The bonding wasn't smooth in a straight line, though. There were setbacks, moments that reminded Ray's just how much damage lived under that scarred coat, moments that mirrored, in ways that made his chest ache, damage he recognized from his own reflection. The first bad one happened during a thunderstorm in early November, a real Georgia gully washer that rolled in fast off the mountains with thunder that cracked close and sharp, no gentle rumble building in the distance, just sudden violent noise that shook the trailer's thin walls. Ray's had been dozing in his chair when the first crack hit, and he came up out of the doze already moving, some old reflex dropping him half off the chair before his conscious mind caught up, and told him it was only weather, only thunder, he was safe, he was home. It took him a moment, heart still hammering, to notice that Chief was gone from his spot by the door. He found the dog wedged into the narrow gap between the refrigerator and the wall, body pressed so tight into the corner that he'd scraped fur loose against the metal edge, panting hard and fast, eyes wide and unseeing in a way that Ray's recognized immediately and completely, because he'd seen that exact look on his own face, reflected back at him from cracked bathroom mirrors, more times than he could count. "Hey," Ray said, dropping to his knees despite the ache it sent through his stump, keeping H. His voice low and even, the voice he used to use talking a nervous junior Marine through the last careful minutes of a disarmament. "Hey, Chief, you're all right. You're not there anymore. You're here." The dog didn't respond to his name, didn't respond to anything, locked somewhere else entirely, some memory of incoming fire or the concussive violence of an explosion that thunder had unlocked without warning. Ray's didn't reach for him, not yet, remembering enough about panic to know that a sudden hand could make things worse before it made them better. Instead, he sat down on the floor, right there in the narrow kitchen, back against the cabinets, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched the dog's shaking flank but not quite touching it, and he started talking, low and steady, the same cadence he'd have used walking a scared young Marine back from the edge of a flashback. "I got you," he said. "You're not there, you're here, you're safe, ain't nobody shooting at you, ain't nothing gonna blow. It's just thunder, just weather, it can't hurt you." He kept his breathing slow and audible, deliberately slow, the way he'd learned in more VA-mandated therapy sessions than he'd wanted to attend but had, grudgingly, found useful. In through the nose, out through the mouth, that's it. That's all we're doing right now. It took nearly 20 minutes, the storm rolling and cracking outside the thin walls the whole time, before Chief's breathing began to slow, before the wild, unseeing look in his good eye started to clear and focus, first on the middle distance, then gradually on Ray's himself. When the dog finally came back to himself fully, he pressed his head hard against Ray's chest and stayed there, trembling in smaller and smaller waves until the trembling stopped altogether. Ray's sat on that kitchen floor a long time after, one hand resting on the dog's shoulder, feeling his own heart rate finally settle back to something normal, and understood with a clarity that hit harder than he expected that he had just talked another living creature down from exactly the kind of place he spent most of his own bad nights trapped inside. "We're a real pair," he said quietly, into the fur behind Chief's torn ear. "Both of us so broken we scare the neighbors. Both of us jumping at noise that can't hurt us anymore." He let out a breath that felt like it had been sitting in his chest for years. "Guess that means we understand each other pretty good." After that night, something between them shifted permanently, some final wall coming down that hadn't come down before. Chief started sleeping closer, first at the foot of Ray's bed instead of the corner of the main room, then within another week, pressed against his side, a warm, solid weight that Ray's found himself, some nights, deliberately not moving away from even when the dog's shifting woke him. There was a physical component to the care, too, one Ray's hadn't been prepared for and found himself, oddly, grateful to have a reason to do. The old wound along Chief's flank, the long puckered scar that had first caught Ray's attention that first night by the trash cans, had never healed quite right, the tissue pulling in a way that cracked and split sometimes when the dog stretched too far or moved too fast, and Dr. Anand had shown Ray's how to clean it properly, how to check for infection, how to apply the antibiotic ointment without causing more pain than necessary. He did it every third day, a small ritual that became, in its own way, sacred to both of them. Chief would lie on his side on an old towel Ray's kept for the purpose, patient and still in a way that told Ray's the dog understood, on some level, that this discomfort was in service of healing rather than harm, and Ray's would work slow and careful, talking the whole time in a low, steady murmur about nothing in particular, the weather, the state of the truck's transmission, half-remembered stories from deployments that he found, to his own surprise. Easier to tell out loud to a dog who couldn't judge him than he'd ever found it to tell a therapist who could. "You know," he said one evening, working ointment gently along the worst part of the scar while Chief lay patient beneath his hands, "Ellery used to talk about you. Not by name, I didn't know your name back then, didn't know Ellery even had a working dog assigned half the time. We weren't exactly close with the K9 unit, different chain of command and all that mess. But he used to talk about a dog that saved his whole squad from walking into a pressure plate nobody'd spotted. Said the dog just stopped dead in the road one day, wouldn't move another step no matter what anybody did, wouldn't take a treat, wouldn't respond to a command, just stood there staring at a patch of ground that looked exactly like every other patch of ground around it." Ray's paused, hands going still against the dog's warm side. Turned out there was a pressure plate buried. Where he was staring, whole squad walked around it because that dog refused to move. That was you, wasn't it? That had to be you. Chief's tail thumped once against the towel, slow and heavy, and Ray's told himself it didn't mean anything, that dogs didn't understand stories, didn't remember specific incidents the way people did. But some other part of him, the part that had spent 11 years learning to trust instinct over doubt in situations where doubt got people killed, believed otherwise completely. The dry humor crept in gradually too, the kind of small, absurd moments that punctuate real life and real healing far more than any dramatic breakthrough ever does. Chief developed a particular habit, one that became, over those weeks, something like his signature, a way of communicating that Ray's came to read as clearly as words. When something troubled him, when he sensed something off in the environment or in Ray's own mood, he wouldn't bark. Old training had apparently conditioned that reflex out of him almost entirely, a silence that made sense for a dog trained to detect explosives in hostile territory where barking could get a whole patrol killed. Instead, he'd go very still, plant his front feet, and let out a single low huff through his nose, sharp and deliberate, a sound Ray's started calling the chief alarm. The first time he heard it used for something almost funny rather than something serious was on a gray afternoon in mid-November, when Ray's was wrestling with the ancient generator that powered half the trailer, cursing at a pull cord that refused to catch, and Chief, watching from a few feet away, let out the huff, sharp and pointed, at the exact moment Ray's grip slipped and he barked his knuckles against the housing. "Oh, you think this is funny," Reyes said, sucking at his bleeding knuckle, glaring at the dog, who sat with his ears up and his head cocked at an angle that Reyes would have sworn, on a stack of Bibles, looked exactly like amusement. "You're supposed to be helping morale, not laughing at me." Chief huffed again, and this time Reyes laughed too, a real laugh surprised out of him, the first one in longer than he wanted to think about, and it felt strange in his chest, like a muscle that had gone stiff from disuse finally remembering how to move. By early December, the routine between them had settled into something that felt less like two damaged creatures orbiting each other out of necessity, and more like an actual partnership, the kind Reyes remembered from his best years in the Corps, when a team worked so smoothly together that words became almost unnecessary. Chief had learned Reyes's rhythms, knew, somehow, the mornings when the phantom pain in his missing leg was bad before Reyes said a word about it, and would press himself close against that side, a steady warm pressure that seemed, unscientifically but undeniably, to help. Reyes had learned Chief's tells in turn, the particular way his ears would flatten just slightly before a flashback took hold, giving Reyes precious seconds to intervene before the storm hit fully. It was during one of their morning walks, the second week of December, frost still silvering the grass in the shadowed parts of the property, that Reyes first noticed something had changed in the woods beyond his land. Chief stopped walking, not the sudden freeze of a startled response, not the trembling stillness of an oncoming flashback. This was different, deliberate, controlled, his body dropping into a low, coiled posture that Reyes recognized immediately from 100 deployment briefings on detection dog behavior, even though he'd never before seen it performed live, right in front of him, in his own back field. Chief's nose was up, working the air in short, precise pulls, and his gaze had fixed on a point in the tree line roughly 40 yards out, near an old fence post that marked the boundary between Reyes's land and the undeveloped timber acreage beyond it. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stood, utterly still, staring, exactly the way Ellery must have once described to Reyes years ago about a road and a pressure plate and a squad that owed its life to a dog's refusal to keep walking. Reyes felt every old instinct in his body snap awake at once. "What is it?" he murmured, more to himself than to the dog, dropping automatically into a lower, more careful posture of his own, scanning the tree line with the trained eye of a man who had once made a career out of spotting things other people missed. "What do you see, Chief?" The dog held the point a full 30 seconds, then slowly sat, which Reyes would learn, through careful observation over the following days, was the closest thing to an all-clear signal in Chief's repertoire, a specific trained behavior indicating that whatever had triggered the alert had passed, at least for the moment. But something in the dog's posture, even after sitting, told Reyes this wasn't over. Ye ears stayed up, the body stayed tense. This was a dog on watch, not a dog at rest. That night Reyes didn't sleep well, and it had nothing to do with his usual reasons. He lay awake in the dark trailer, Chief pressed warm against his side, both of them listening to a silence that felt, for the first time in months, less like peace and more like the particular quiet that comes before something. 2 nights later, the quiet broke. Reyes woke to Chief's weight leaving the bed entirely, a sensation so unusual. The dog had not voluntarily left his side during sleep in nearly 3 weeks. That Reyes was awake and alert before his conscious mind had even processed why. He found Chief standing rigid at the trailer's single front window, nose nearly touching the glass, body locked in that same coiled stillness from the tree line, staring out into a yard lit only by a thin sliver of moon. Reyes moved to the window without turning on any lights, old habits keeping him low and quiet, and looked out to see 2 shapes moving along the tree line at the edge of his property, flashlight beams swept low and careful, the particular economical movement of people who didn't want to be noticed and knew how to move that way. His pulse kicked up, but his mind, trained across 11 years to go cold and clear exactly when panic wanted to take over, settled into something sharper. He didn't reach for a phone. He didn't turn on a light. He reached instead for the old tactical flashlight he kept in the drawer by his bed, more out of habit than any real plan, and he crouched beside Chief at the window, one hand resting on the dog's back, feeling the tension coiled there like a drawn bowstring. "Stay," he breathed, barely audible, and Chief, extraordinarily, held. The two figures moved along the tree line for another several minutes, pausing at points that Ray's noted with a survey or's precision, then withdrew back into the deeper timber without ever approaching the trailer directly. Reconnaissance, Ray's thought, an old and unwelcome word surfacing from a part of his brain he'd hoped never to need again. Somebody's scouting the property. Somebody's planning something. He didn't sleep the rest of that night. Neither did Chief. The next morning, moving with the deliberate calm of a man falling back into old skills he'd never actually forgotten, Ray's walked the tree line where the figures had been, and found, wedged into the fork of an old oak roughly 60 yards from the trailer, a small weatherproofed camera, motion-activated, angled directly at his front door. He stood there a long moment, holding the small device in his palm, feeling something in him go very quiet and very focused, the exact mental state he used to enter in the seconds before approaching a device he didn't yet understand. "Somebody's watching us," he said, and Chief, sitting at his heel, let out a single low huff, sharp and certain, an answer that needed no further translation. Ray's called Ortiz that afternoon, laying out everything, the tattoo, the records, the gap in the paperwork, the two figures in the tree line, the camera hidden in the oak, and Ortiz went quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, the particular quiet of a man doing math he didn't like the answer to. "Danny," he said finally, "I did some more digging after we talked last, because something about this whole thing was bothering me too much to leave alone. That equipment failure report from your incident, I found the name of the officer who signed off on it as final, Lieutenant Colonel Grant Voss." Ray's felt something cold settle into his chest. "I know that name." "Figured you might. He was your battalion's liaison to Aegis Tactical during that deployment, wasn't he?" "He was more than that," Ray's said slowly, memory surfacing details he'd buried a long time ago. "He pushed hard for that contract, overrode two separate procurement recommendations that flagged Aegis's detection equipment as underperforming compared to established vendors. I remember because Ellery complained about it at the time, said the gear felt off, said he trusted his dog's nose more than half the equipment they were issuing." "Voss retired 2 years after your incident," Ortiz said. "Guess where he works now?" Ray's already knew the answer before Ortiz said it, the pieces falling into a shape that made the cold stone in his gut turn fully into something hard and purposeful. "Aegis Tactical Solutions," Ray's said. "He's working for the same company whose equipment killed Ellery and cost me my leg, the same company that's supposed to have Chief on record as non-recoverable." "Vice President of Operations," Ortiz confirmed. "And Danny, the more I dig, the more I'm finding a pattern that goes well beyond your incident. There's at least 2 other equipment failure complaints from different units, both buried, both signed off by Voss personally before he retired from active duty. There's also a whistleblow. Our complaint filed by a junior Aegis engineer 18 months ago, alleging the company knowingly shipped detection units with a documented calibration defect to cut costs, and that complaint went nowhere. The engineer who filed it got quietly let go for performance issues 3 weeks later." "And the dogs," Ray's said, understanding arriving all at once, cold and complete. "If a K9 gets separated from its handler in an incident tied to defective equipment, and that dog eventually gets recovered and evaluated, and somebody with the right training can read that dog's alert behavior." "It's evidence," Ortiz finished. "A working detection dog doesn't lie about what it was trained to find, Danny. If Chief's alert behavior can be documented, tied to a verified deployment history, tied to your incident, That's a living record that contradicts whatever cover story Aegis put in their official report. That's exactly the kind of thing a company like that would want to make disappear quietly, the same way they made him disappear the first time. Reyes looked across the trailer at Chief, who lay watching him with that patient, steady gaze, and felt a fierce and unfamiliar protectiveness rise up in his chest, sharp enough to nearly take his breath away. "They're not taking him," Reyes said, quiet and absolutely certain. "Whatever else happens here, they are not taking this dog again." Ortiz was quiet a moment. "You need to be smart about this. Document everything. Get the camera to a lawyer, or better yet, to a journalist who knows how to handle this kind of story. Don't go playing cowboy out there alone. These aren't people who play by rules you'd recognize." "I know how these people play," Reyes said. "I've got 11 years of experience learning exactly how people like this operate. I'll be smart. But I'm not calling the sheriff's office and hoping Deputy Kessler knows what to do with a corporate conspiracy tied to a defense contractor. This needs to go higher, and it needs to go there with proof in hand, not just a story." Over the following week, Reyes worked with a methodical patience that surprised even himself, old skills sliding back into place like a familiar weapon reassembled in the dark. He photographed the camera before removing it, documented its location with GPS coordinates, preserved it carefully as potential evidence. He drove the 11 miles to Dr. Annan's clinic and asked her to write up a formal veterinary assessment of Chief's condition, the scarring, the old injuries, cross-referenced against the tattoo identification Ortiz had confirmed. He reached out through a contact of Ortiz's to a reporter named Elena Marsh, who had built a reputation covering defense contractor accountability issues for a regional outlet with real teeth, and spent 2 hours on the phone with her laying out everything he had, careful and precise, resisting the urge to editorialize, letting the facts carry their own weight the way facts do when they're strong enough. Marsh was cautious but interested, the particular interest of a journalist who smelled a real story and wanted to be sure before she committed to chasing it. "Give me a week," she said. "I've got sources inside DoD procurement oversight. If even half of what you're describing checks out, this could be significant. But I need more than a dog's tattoo and a suspicious camera, Mr. Reyes. I need paper." He understood that. He'd spent his whole career understanding the difference between suspicion and proof, and he set himself, over the following days, to closing that gap, filing formal records requests through the VA and DoD channels available to him as a veteran, requesting his own after-action reports, requesting any available documentation on Chief's post-incident disposition, building, piece by careful piece, a paper trail that couldn't be dismissed. Chief, through all of it, remained watchful in a way that told Reyes the threat hadn't passed, only paused. Twice more in that week, the dog alerted on the tree line at night, that same coiled stillness, that same silent, deliberate stare, and twice more Reyes found evidence of a presence, a fresh boot print in the soft mud near the fence line. A cigarette butt of a brand Reyes didn't recognize ground out carefully, but not carefully enough near the old camera's original position. They were watching, waiting perhaps for the right moment, or gathering their own information before deciding how to act. Reyes didn't know which, and the not knowing kept a low, constant hum of tension running under everything he did that week, the same hum he remembered from deployments, the particular alertness of a man who knows danger is present but hasn't yet located its exact shape. The confrontation, when it came on a moonless night in the third week of December, cold enough that Reyes's breath fogged even inside the trailer, cold enough that he'd banked the little wood stove high before bed and still felt the chill pang in at the edges of the single room. He woke not to sound exactly, but to Chief's absolute stillness beside him, a stillness so complete it was itself an alarm, the dog's whole body gone rigid, ears locked forward, nose working the air in short, controlled pulls. Reyes was awake and moving within seconds, old training overriding sleep the way it always had, dropping low, reaching for the flashlight, then thinking better of it and leaving it dark, moving instead to the window by feel and years of memorized geometry. Two figures again, but closer this time, already crossing the open ground between the tree line and the trailer, moving with the deliberate economy of people trained to move quietly, one carrying something long and rectangular that Ray's trained eye identified, with a cold lurch as a fuel canister. They weren't here to watch anymore. Ray's mind went very clear and very cold, the exact mental state that had once let him disarm devices with his hands steady, while his heart hammered underneath a calm exterior. He had no weapon beyond an old aluminum baseball bat that had come with the trailer, and a folding knife he kept for utility purposes. Nothing like the tools he'd once carried, but he had something else these two intruders almost certainly weren't prepared for. 11 years of training in exactly the kind of controlled, methodical violence that ends confrontations fast and decisively, and a partner whose training matched his own in ways these men couldn't possibly anticipate. "Chief," he breathed, barely a whisper, and the dog's eyes flicked to him, alert and ready, waiting for direction the way a trained partner waits, not out of obedience alone, but out of trust built across weeks of mutual care. "Quiet, stay close." He didn't call the sheriff yet. Kessler was 20 minutes out on a good night, and whatever was about to happen would be over long before those 20 minutes passed. Instead, he moved to the trailer's rear door, the one facing away from the approaching figures, easing it open without a sound, and slipped out into the freezing dark with Chief moving silent as smoke beside him, both of them falling into the tree line along the property's edge, circling wide and low, the exact kind of flanking movement Ray's had executed 100 times in training and more times than he wanted to count in actual combat. He caught sight of the two men near the trailer's front corner, one crouched low near the propane tank that fed the trailer's small heater, working at something with careful, practiced hands, the other standing watch a few feet back, head on a swivel, the fuel canister set down beside him. Ray's felt a surge of cold fury at the calculation being made here, the deliberate targeting of the propane line, an act meant to look, after the fact, like a tragic accident rather than what it actually was. These weren't amateurs. This was planned, professional, exactly the kind of clean, deniable violence a company like Aegis would contract out to make an inconvenient witness disappear, along with the evidence he represented. He moved closer, using the deep shadow of the old collapsed barn for cover, Chief a low, silent shape beside him, and when he was close enough, he gave the dog a single, barely their hand signal, an old field gesture that meant hold position, and Chief obeyed instantly, dropping to a crouch in the shadow, coiled and ready but still, trusting Ray's judgment about timing the way he'd once trusted a handler he'd never see again. Ray's closed the final distance on the watchman fast and low, years of close quarters training taking over in a way that felt less like decision and more like muscle memory, finally given permission to act. The man barely had time to register the movement before Ray's was on him, one hand clamping over his mouth to kill any shout, the other arm sweeping his legs out from under him in a controlled takedown that put him flat on the frozen ground, with Ray's knee planted hard between his shoulder blades before he'd fully processed what was happening. The crouched man at the propane line spun at the sound of the scuffle, hand diving toward his jacket, and this was the moment Ray's had been counting on, the moment he'd given Chief the signal for. "Chief," he said, sharp and clear now, no need for silence anymore. "Take him." The dog moved like something poured rather than something running, closing the distance in under 2 seconds, and hit the second man's extended arm exactly, as he'd been trained to do years before in a program designed to disable armed threats without lethal force, jaws closing hard around the forearm and driving the man's balance backward and down before the weapon in his jacket ever cleared its holster. The man screamed, more in shock than in real pain, the bite controlled and precise the way Ray's had read professional protection-trained dogs could manage, and went down hard onto his back, Chief's weight pinning the injured arm while the dog's good eye and clouded eye both stayed locked on the man's face, a low, steady growl vibrating through him that promised worse if the man moved wrong. "Don't," Ray's called out, voice carrying flat and hard across the frozen yard, still kneeling on the back of the first man who had gone still and compliant beneath him, apparently understanding fast that this had not gone at all the way tonight's plan had called for. "Don't you move a muscle. That dog's got a bite rated to hold a man twice your size, and he is not letting go until I tell him to." It took Ray's another 2 minutes of careful, methodical work, restraining the first man with a length of paracord he kept in his jacket pocket out of old habit, then approaching the second man carefully, keeping Chief in place with a low murmured command, retrieving the weapon that had fallen clear during the takedown, before he finally allowed himself to reach for his phone and dial the number he'd been avoiding calling all night, and even then he called Ortiz first. In case something happened to him before the sheriff arrived, wanting somebody who understood the full shape of this to know what had gone down. "It's happening," he said, breathing hard, adrenaline finally starting to catch up with him now that the immediate danger had passed. "Two men. Aegis, I'd bet everything I own on it. They came to torch the trailer, make it look like a propane accident. Chief and I stopped them. I need you to call that reporter right now tonight, before anybody has a chance to spin this into something it wasn't." Then he called Kessler, and this time, when the cruiser's lights came sweeping up the gravel drive 20 minutes later, Ray's didn't feel that old cold dread rise in his chest. This time, for once, the uniform arriving meant something had already been handled, not something about to go wrong. What followed over the next several weeks unfolded with the particular slow grinding momentum of institutional justice, finally catching up to something that should have been stopped a long time before. The two men detained that night, private contractors working, records eventually confirmed, under a shell company with financial ties traced back 3 layers to Aegis Tactical Solutions, gave statements, under the specific pressure of facing arson and attempted murder charges, that named names and confirmed exactly the kind of cover-up Ortiz had suspected. Elena Marsh's investigation, fed by the paper trail Rays had built and now supplemented with the criminal case's discovery materials, ran as a 3-part series that named Lieutenant Colonel Grant Voss directly, laid out the pattern of buried equipment failure complaints across 3 separate units, and detailed the calibration defect the fired whistleblower had originally tried to expose. Voss was indicted on federal charges related to defense contract fraud and obstruction within 2 months. Aegis Tactical Solutions lost its DoD contract entirely, and a congressional subcommittee opened a formal inquiry into equipment procurement oversight that Ortiz told Rays, with grim satisfaction, was likely to change how several other contracts got reviewed going forward. Rays was offered money at several points during that process, a settlement from Aegis's lawyers hoping to make the whole matter quietly disappear before it went further, a reward from a veterans advocacy organization that had picked up the story and wanted to make an example of supporting the man who'd exposed it. He took none of it beyond what covered his own legal costs and Chief's ongoing veterinary care, a decision that confused more than a few people who tried to talk him into accepting more. It was never about the money, he told Elena Marsh, in the one interview he agreed to give once the legal dust had mostly settled, sitting on his own front porch with Chief lying across his feet in the thin winter sunlight. It was about a dog that got left behind and a friend who died because somebody decided cutting corners was worth the risk. Money doesn't fix either one of those things. It just makes people feel like they've paid a debt they haven't actually paid. What he did accept gladly was something smaller and far more meaningful to him, a formal DoD review that overturned the non-recoverable designation on Chief's service record, replacing it with an honorable retirement classification, complete with the modest veteran's benefit that came attached to it, enough to cover the dog's veterinary needs for the rest of his life without further strain on Reyes' own thin resources. Ortiz drove down from 3 states away for the small ceremony that marked it, a quiet gathering on Reyes' own property with Dr. Anand, Deputy Kessler, who'd become, in the intervening weeks, something unexpectedly close to a friend, and even Carol Whitfield, the neighbor whose frightened phone call had started the whole chain of events, standing a respectful distance back with her poodle, watching with an expression that had shifted, over the preceding months, from fear to something like quiet awe. Reyes' own VA disability rating got revisited too, in the wake of the publicity, corrected upward to a level that finally reflected the reality of his injuries, rather than the bureaucratic shortcuts that had denied him for so long. He used part of the retroactive payment to finally fix the trailer's ancient electric range, a small, almost comically mundane improvement that felt, to him, like the truest measure of how far he'd come. He was cooking real meals again. He was sleeping through most nights. He'd started, tentatively, talking to a therapist through the VA's telehealth program, something he'd have laughed off as pointless a year before. On a clear, cold evening in late January, the kind of evening where the sky over Caldwell County went a deep, endless blue just before full dark, Reyes sat on his front porch steps with a mug of real coffee, not instant, and watched Chief moving slow and content across the frost-touched grass, nose down, following some scent trail that led nowhere in particular, simply enjoying the freedom of an open field with nothing to fear in it. "You did good, you know," Reyes said, when the dog finally circled back and settled beside him, leaning that solid, familiar weight against his leg. "Better than good. You did what you were trained to do, all those years ago, and it took this long for anybody to finally listen." Chief huffed once, low and soft, the particular sound Reyes had come to understand as something between agreement and contentment, and rested his scarred head against Reyes' knee, the clouded eye and the good dark eye both turned up toward the darkening sky. Reyes looked down at him a long moment, at the torn ear and the faded scar and the patchy fur that had, over these past months, begun filling back in soft and full, and felt something settle in his own chest that he recognized, with a kind of quiet astonishment, as peace. Not the absence of hard memory, not the erasure of everything he'd lost, just peace sitting right alongside all of it, the way it was maybe always meant to. "Neighbors called the cops on you, you know," he said, and there was real warmth in it now, warmth that hadn't been there the day it actually happened. Scared half to death of a war hero and didn't even know it. Chief's tail thumped twice against the porch boards, slow and easy, and out beyond the tree line. The last of the winter light faded gold and then blue and then gone, leaving just the two of them together, exactly where they were meant to be. If this story moved you, take a second right now and hit that like button, because it genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like Daniel and Chief's. Subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss the next one, because there are so many more veterans and dogs out there whose stories deserve to be told with this same care. Drop a comment and let us know what part of this one stayed with you, whether it was the storm, the confrontation, or just that quiet final image on the porch. And if you know someone who loves stories about loyalty, second chances, and the bond between a soldier and the animal who never gave up on him, go ahead and share this with them right now. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.